Hi, everyone. So I am Vanessa Sochat. I am a research software engineer at the Stanford Research Computing Center, SRCC. And today I'm indeed going to tell you a story of adding an operator to Airflow, a contributor overflow exception. But before that, you're probably wondering, why the heck am I here? Well, I'm here for the same reason that a lot of you are here, because we want to talk about community. Interacting with a new open source community is a really common experience when you're an open source developer. And when things go really well, everything's great. But when expectations are misaligned, you can have a really strained interaction that leads to bad things for the project. And so you're probably seeing a little bit of foreshadowing that this is what we're going to be talking about today. So without further ado, let's start this story. Once upon a time, there were contributors and there were reviewers. And the contributors would say, hey, I've made changes to the code base. Could you take a look? And the reviewers would say, I see you've made changes to the code base. Let me take a look. But it's not really this simple, is it? It's not so black and white. Let me start again. This is totally wrong. Once upon a time, there were people, and they really cared about open source software. They loved working on container technologies and programming languages and workflow tools. And the intersection of these things was really interesting because this is where collaborations happened. And actually, to be fair, probably people have their favorites out of these things. So let's scooch everyone a little bit closer to their favorite technology. Now let's introduce a new player in this open source landscape, the open source developer. This is Pushinicat. Now, Pushinicat isn't really tied to one specific community, but she sort of dances around this open source landscape and finds interesting connections between projects to work on. So Pushinicat is going to be the main character in our story today. So what happened to Pushinicat? Well, first Pushinicat found Apache Airflow, and she couldn't tell you exactly how she did. Maybe it was on Hacker News, maybe it was on Twitter, but she said, this looks really neat. I wonder if I should contribute to this. Well, I really love Python. I especially love containers, and I maintain this library for a container technology, Singularity, that is specifically for Python and containers. Yeah, I should add the Singularity operator. This is totally in my wheelhouse. How do I start? Well, I can look at all the other operators out there. Here's one for Docker. I'll mimic that one. And so on March 15th, 2019, Pushinicat opened a pull request. It was reviewed many times, lots of comments. It went green multiple times, and it kind of kept stalling. It would stall for a month, and then another month, and then 4 months. But community members kept coming on and say, hey, this would be really useful. Let's push this forward. But, even with that help, it kind of stalled for another 4 months, and it got to this state where it was impossible to rebase, and the pull request was closed. So if you came back and you asked Pushinicat, what happened? She might have said, I don't know. I feel like they forgot about me. I thought I did everything right. I checked off all the boxes. The pull request was green. It must be something like that. But maybe if we had asked the community, they would have said, Pushinicat was not persistent enough. She didn't follow the instructions. Her PR was not of the highest quality. And so I hope that what you see here is that we're going to be telling a story about misaligned incentives. Because it's the case that both contributors and reviewers, they both have their own set of incentives and expectations. And so when these things are really aligned, things are great. So if I am a contributor and I care about the community, this is going to be reflected in my interactions on the pull request, for example. And the reviewers can look at that and be like, yeah, this person cares about the community. That is what I would expect. On the other hand, both parties probably want an efficient review. No surprise there. But let's look at another example. Let's say that a contributor is there because they just have to do something for their job. Their boss said, you must implement this feature, just go do it. The reviewer may sense in their interactions that they don't care so much about this, as much about the community as they would expect them to, and say, why doesn't this person seem to care about the community? On the other hand, let's say that the reviewer expects the contributor to be persistent and to advocate for herself. And the contributor doesn't know this. They're going to say, why did they forget about me? And so you're probably thinking, Vanessa, this is totally based on the individuals involved. You can't create this archetype for one contributor and one reviewer. And I would say I totally agree with you. So to have a little fun, we are going to actually talk about some of the archetypes that we tend to see on both sides of a pull request, starting with reviewers. So the first kind of reviewer is the maintainer. So this is the person that may be uniquely responsible for the longevity, the future of the software. They're thinking about the design, they're getting stressed because there's so many issues and so many pull requests open. Based on this choice of graphic, you can tell that this person has a lot of stress because they often have to deal with disgruntled contributors. So a very high stress, high responsibility role. One level down from that is the project member. So they may also be part of the organization, part of the project, and be doing a lot of the same tasks, but they may not have that same level of stress where they're falling asleep at night and being like, oh my God, the project, the vision, where's it going? One level down from that is the long-term contributor who maybe came along and contributed and had a really good experience and keeps coming back and now is a regular person on pull requests, issues, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so now let's talk about some archetypes for contributors. The first is the job-seeking deputy. Now, this is the person that is there because they want to impress you, or maybe they want to just build up their GitHub profile to impress an employer. So they are going to read all the documentation, do everything right, really, really try to go out of their way to please you. On the other hand, if you have a worker bee, this is, as we alluded to earlier, someone's there because kind of like they have to, and their boss told them they have to do it. So they will follow best practices and they will be polite, but they're not going to really bend over backwards to try to impress you. And at the end of a 9-to-5 work day, they're out of there. So finally, we have the taste tester. So the taste tester is one of these open source developers that kind of dances around the landscape and comes to your repository, takes a taste, makes a contribution, but probably isn't going to come back for a second taste. But on the other hand, the wandering developer is a special kind of taste tester that does the same thing, except if they have a good experience, they're going to come back for seconds. Okay, so now I'll tell you the story. Once upon a time, on March 15th, 2019, Pushinicat opened a pull request. And it was a great pull request. She said, hey, Airflow maintainers, I'm working on the Singularity operator because I like Singularity containers. And here's what I'm doing. And oh, I see that I need to open this Jira issue. I'm not sure about that. Can you tell me about it? Can we also talk about testing? So this is Grandfather Octocat. Grandfather Octocat is going to jump in every once in a while and give us a good open source tip. So Grandfather Octocat says the pull request template is often the first interaction, and he is totally right. This was the first time that Pushinicat sort of stopped and said, oh, I should look at how to do this on Jira, and I should look at how to do this on testing. And so what you wouldn't want to do is you wouldn't want to have like a list of 10,000 things in this pull request template because it might overwhelm the contributor. So because the contributor bandwidth is limited, you really want to be selective about what you ask contributors to do in this first interaction. And so naturally, not even a day later, Elmo came to the scene. And Elmo was like, hey, Pushinicat, Jira is really simple. Here's how you open a ticket and blah, 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 blah. And so Grandfather Octocat says reviewing promptly and answering questions is really good practice. And this is exactly what Elmo did. So with Elmo's help, Pushinicat was able to open this Jira ticket. And then Elmo followed up and he answered her question. He also asked for some clarification because he wasn't really familiar with Singularity containers. He was like, hey, Pushinicat, could you tell me more about Singularity? And Pushinicat delivered. She said, yes, Singularity is a container technology. It's for high performance computing because Docker has this daemon thing. But could you tell me still a little more about testing? Because I really don't understand how we're supposed to mock a Singularity install. I mean, like that's because Pushinicat knew that installing Singularity was a non-trivial thing. Elmo says, don't worry, I will give you more information about testing. Here's how the testing works. Pushinicat was like, I know about unit testing, but I don't understand how we're going to mock this, installing Singularity, because I think we kind of have to install Singularity. Elmo said, don't worry, I have created you this test and you can test it. And so here's the first tiny example of where there was a little bit of miscommunication between Elmo and Pushinicat, because Elmo really expected Pushinicat to curl this paste bin, pipe it right into a git amend, and then just push it. But Pushinicat wanted to look at the code and do her own changes and then push. And so that's what she did. And you can see that Elmo was confused because he said, I don't understand. You could have just copy pasted this command and we would have been done. So the point here is that you really want to have good communication for each step. Even these tiny communication things in a thread, it's important that you think about what your expectation and what the expectations of the other person are. So they continued with good conversation, good communication. Elmo said, here's the test that we need, Pushina Cat. And Pushina Cat had trouble, and thankfully Elmo was very empathetic. He said, don't worry. He probably understood that, using this new mock was non-trivial for Pushina Cat. He said, I will prepare you more examples today. And so with their working together, they were able to finish the PR, code cov ran, and the PR went green, and everyone was really happy. But then a month passed. And actually, to be fair, a month is not a very long time in this open source landia because everyone is doing their own thing and busy, so a month is a very reasonable time to pass. But someone came back to the pull request and said, test passed, but there's these conflicts to resolve. And Pushina Cat was like, I can fix those, I'm on it. Not sure why they're there. And it was interesting because there was new Flake 8 errors, and Pushina Cat was like, did something change? No worries, fix it, we're green again, awesome. And then 4 months passed. So I guess for some communities, 4 months might be considered like not super long, but to Pushina Cat, it felt like a really long time. I mean, a third of a year, I don't know. And then this guy showed up. Now, as GitHub bots go, there's a couple that are kind of fun to see, but you don't want to see this guy because this guy is Stalebot. And he showed up and he's like, hey, Pushina Cat, this issue is kind of stinky. I think it's about time that we close it if no further activity occurs. Thank you for your contribution. And Pushina Cat was disappointed, but she thought about it and she said, I thought this was really important for the community, but I could be wrong. It may be that others don't really need or want the singularity operator, and that's okay. I can accept that. And she was a little bit proud. She said, Airflow bot, don't close the pull request. I'll take care of this for you. And so Grandfather Octocat says it's a really good idea to have a community strategy for managing reviews. Now, arguably, having this bot was the strategy because it would bring people back to look at it. And actually, that's what happened. Well, about a month later, someone came along and said, hey, what's the status on this? It would be super useful to have a singularity operator. And then Elmo came to the rescue again. He said, I will do the rebase on my fork. I've been gone, but I am back. But there were conflicts again. And Stalebot came back, and he marked the stale label. But on that same day, another community member came back and said, I'd like to provide support for this to be merged. We need to use Singularity or in an HPC with Airflow. And then Pushina Cat said, I thought so too. And someone else said, yeah, me three. And again, they said, Pushina Cat, there's these files that you edited. Why did you edit these files? Test Cassandra hook? What does that have to do with your operator? And Pushina Cat was like, I didn't. I'm not sure. Meanwhile, on Twitter, because, in open source, everything sort of bleeds into everywhere else and you can't really hide. It seems that there had been some paper in GigaScience that was talking about Airflow, and this person here was quoting them, and he said, unlike some of the workflow executors, Airflow supports singularity containerization. I thought Pushina Cat was working on that, but it wasn't really merged. And Pushina Cat was kind of embarrassed. She said, I don't understand how the community operates. I've tried, and the pull request has been open a really long time. I largely gave up. And she was embarrassed that she had tried to do this, and obviously there was some support from the community, but she didn't know how to do it. So back on the pull request, hey, Pushina Cat, I'd really love to add support for Singularity to Airflow, but I just don't understand why you've been editing these files. And Pushina Cat again said, look, I really don't know. And then Elmo came in with his ever wisdom, and he said, I think this happened because we performed a merge instead of rebase. And so the problem came down to Pushina Cat needing to do something that she didn't know she needed to do. Again, a misaligned sort of expectation. And so then a new community member came on the pull request. Maybe I think he saw it on Twitter. And he responded to something that Pushina Cat said. She had referenced everyone else on the Airflow board as your team. And it seemed that he took offense to that because he said, Pushina Cat, there is no your team here. We are all contributors and people, and we're working in our free times at the expense of our families and our personal time. And sometimes things take longer than you would expect in a commercial setting. And I've often opened PRs for months and weeks, and I waited until I get enough feedback for others to merge, especially if it's big. And, I am so humble and I'm so patient when I do that. And I continually rebasing. And, why are you not? You are not humble. You are not persistent enough. Why not? Why aren't you empathetic to the open source landscape? You don't know how to rebase. You didn't know these right tools to use. I really think a lot of people would love to see the singularity operator, but you really need to meet this quality bar. And Pushina Cat had trouble with this because she really didn't understand that quality bar. To her, it felt like she just kept getting forgotten about. And so this particular post, Pushina Cat looks back and she thinks that this was done with the best of intentions to try to be supportive, to try to explain, because maybe they thought she was a super new contributor in open source. But it could have come across as a little patronizing. So Grandfather Octocat says, you should be supportive and not patronizing when you're interacting with someone. Because especially little lines like these, I'm trying not to be bitter about it. That kind of suggests that this person thinks that Pushina Cat was being bitter, which she didn't totally agree with. And so Pushina Cat wanted to respond respectfully and communicate clearly. She said, I really understand how open source works, but I really think that a new contributor needs more support from the community. A new contributor needs guidance. And I really didn't know what to do, and I really wanted that guidance. And so one particular thing that she said, a new contributor needs guidance, the other party responded to very strongly. So he posted this one really long comment. This is one thread that's sort of put together sideways on the slide. And he said, Pushina Cat, you might want to take a look at this thread I recently started in the dev list about being a more welcoming community. And I'd really encourage you to join this dev list about this community and voice your opinion. And, over the years, this quote that I really value, if there's something that is painful, start doing it more often. And did you know that we updated the pull request guidelines and described the requirements for contribution? And we have a new contributors workflow. And there's first-time contributors workflows. And you can learn this new Breeze development tool. It makes everything really easy. We also have detailed testing documentation, and Pushina Cat. Psh. So this was totally overwhelming to Pushina Cat because it was like this wave of information, everything but the kitchen sink, and there wasn't anything actionable here that she sort of knew how to deal with. And remember, it breaks this sort of cardinal rule that your contributor bandwidth is limited and you really need to be selective about what you ask them to do. And also, if you're going to give them resources like this, it's important that you give them targeted resources, so something that will explicitly help them for whatever they're trying to do. Meanwhile, back on Twitter, the same contributor showed up on Twitter and said, hey, Pushina Cat, please look at all the documentation here. Our community has best practices and it's up to you to know them. And Pushina Cat says, I have tried so hard. I really don't think I can expect to know this entire culture for a new community. And you know what? I am really burnt out on this. Oh, well, Pushina Cat, I'm happy to help you as a mentor if you need it. And we have discussion of mentorship on the dev list and being a more welcome community. Here's the link. Let's try this out. Please also join our Slack. We have a newbie question channel on Apache Airflow. And Pushina Cat, again, she was overwhelmed because she just wanted advocation for her code. She wanted to focus on the code. She didn't want to join a Slack and try all these new dev lists. It was too much. And thankfully, someone showed up and advocated for her. And she said, I don't think this is the kind of support that Pushina Cat needs. I think she needs advocation for pushing her code forward. Whew. So, how to move forward. This was a crossroads because Pushina Cat could have decided, what? I am so burnt out. I'm tired. I just want to run away as fast as I can. Or she could have said, this is really important for the Singularity community, and I know that now, so I'm just going to keep trying until it's done. And that's what she decided to do. She opened a second pull request. She made sure to check off all the boxes. And there was a lot of discussion back and forth. And this was really fun because it felt like the way a pull request should be, where you're focusing on the code, talking about it, fixing tests. And Pushina Cat made sure to tell them explicitly, I am so appreciative that this one is going so well. Thank you so much. But then this happened. Why is this so hard for you? So that same community member came back and they said, I have a question, Pushina Cat. It seems that for some reason it is quite difficult to follow, for you at least. Now, up to this point, Pushinicat had looked at everything that this particular contributor had said on GitHub and on Twitter, and had really believed that it was said with the best intentions, trying to be supportive, and maybe just not said in the best way, but she was okay with that. But this was the first thing that really kind of hurt, because it really targeted her. It's saying, everyone else, this is rather easy, but you are this outlier. This is so hard for you. And so Grandfather Octocat, and I hope everyone listening sort of knows this intuitively, that a pull request or anywhere where you're talking about, developing code, you never want to target another person. And if you target them, you especially do not want to be mean, because it has consequences for your community. And so Pushinicat took a deep breath, and she gave this community member exactly what he wanted. She wrote up very detailed feedback about what had happened and what might be better. And she said, okay, here are my thoughts. I hope they're helpful. And then she moved on in a new comment and said, you know what, now let's focus on this code. Let's talk about how we're going to do this testing. And they kept working. And actually, there was one point in February where it was forgotten about for a few weeks. But this time, she advocated for herself, and she was pushy, and she said, ping. Now, it's not always great in open source to be pushy like this, but if a community culture sort of calls for it, it's something you need to do. And so they had a lot of discussion. You can see 66 hidden items. And then after a lot of work, because the master branch had changed considerably since the original work and everything was sort of in a different organization, Pushinicat would carefully do a change and then push and then see the testing. And with this careful work, everything went green and it passed and everyone was happy. There was another robot that was super happy, and it was merged and everyone on Twitter was going crazy. Well, maybe it wasn't that big, and it was announced that it would be released in 2.0. So success, right? I mean, the operator was merged. That means this was successful. Well, maybe not. So I hope you can see there was a lot of misaligned incentives here. And when you think about the people interaction here, it may not have been as successful as we would have wanted. And so Pushinicat entered this interaction because she wanted to have fun. She wanted to add the singularity operator because she thought it would be useful. But the expectation on the other side was that she read all this documentation, keep up to date, and really push for next steps. And so Pushinicat expected this sort of supportive environment, but on the other hand, she was expected to know all these things and be informed and advocate for herself, and that didn't really line up. And so what do we learn from this? How do we learn from this so we make sure that it doesn't happen again? Well, a project cannot only assume one kind of contributor. And I've been a maintainer on many projects. I know it's easy to get used to your sort of standard contributor and then expect them to sort of know all the secrets. But not all contributors will do that. And not all contributors want to please you. Even, they might just want to add their special feature. And obviously, you should never bring up personal issues in a review. Why is this so hard for you? Should never be something that you talk about. You need to focus on the code. And also, there's sort of this unspoken shared responsibility between contributors and between people that are reviewing the pull request, that it's up to the contributor to open the pull request and check off all the boxes and make sure it turns green and then respond to requests from the reviewers. But when everything's green and the boxes are checked and sort of we're waiting, the responsibility shifts over to the reviewers, and it's up to them to be like, oh, I'd like more changes, or oh, we're ready to go, or we'll merge it after these certain criteria are met. And finally, you should expect the contributor to be informed within the scope of the contribution. So that pull request template, maybe links that you put there, maybe you could expect them to know about that, but you shouldn't expect them to know all the stuff that's in your documentation everywhere elsewhere on the internet. And so the interesting thing is that these technical discussions, although they're technical in nature, they really come down to people, and so they require empathy. So I find it helpful when you're having any kind of interaction with someone to ask questions to yourself to be more empathetic. So the first question is, why is the other person here? The other person's going to have goals that drive their incentives and actions. What are they? Can you better understand them? The next thing is, what are our shared goals? So it's obvious when you're working on a pull request, you get distracted and you start talking about pancakes and all these other things. And it's good to remind yourself of these shared goals. You can say, okay, I know we just had that argument about pancakes, but you know what? Let's get back on track. We both want this thing. Let's talk about what we need to do to get that thing. And finally, what don't you know? What expectations about the other person don't you know? Because, you can ask the other person. You can say, hey, have you seen this? Do you know how to do this? So what are the consequences when you aren't empathetic? Well, when you have a contributor and they show up at your community, you really want it to go well. You want them to be like, that was super fun. I'm going to come back and do this again. you don't want them to sort of be a deer in headlights or be shocked and be like, I don't know what just happened, but I think I'm going to go over here right now. So as Pushini Cat is wandering around this open source landscape, we really, really want her to have a good interaction so that she comes back, the community grows, it gets stronger. And so it's interesting because just as Pushini Cat has this story, every one of us, me, you, everyone listening, every one of us has our own developer story. And it's interesting because each of our stories is part of this much larger, bigger open source story. It's that lovely idea that we're sort of working on something much larger than ourselves. So although it might be said that the community is responsible for someone's experience, so you can point at your code of conduct and your community reputation and be like, yeah, my community is really great. We have all this stuff online. It really is the fact that I am, you am, we all are responsible for creating this positive experience, because it doesn't matter what your code of conduct or your documents or your community's reputation is. If you are mean to someone on a pull request, you reflect on your community. And so you need to stand up for that. And so there's sort of an unspoken hero to this story, and maybe some of you caught it, but the hero of the story is Elmo, because Elmo was continually supportive and kind and patient and kept coming back and just being more of that. So if you take absolutely nothing away from my talk, which is okay because talks are long, it can be very boring, be like Elmo. So that's all I got. I'm VSOC on Twitter and GitHub. Thanks for listening.
Them into the Slack channel. We have the oh sure, no worries. Yeah, so so let's go. Thank you, Vanessa, for sharing the story. It's very I could recognize a lot of parts of it. Developers love bike shedding, right? Talking about stuff around it. And big kudos for Elmo. So if you have any questions for Vanessa, or maybe if you want to ask something, please post the questions into the Slack channel. On the Airflow Slack, we have the Airflow Summit attendees, and you can just put anything in there that you want to ask to Vanessa. Yeah, I had one question. So you mentioned that it's not it's rude to be pushy, the ping, right? I think it might depend on context or culture, but I think it's not a bad thing to do. At least I don't. Sometimes, right now I'm a bit more. I'm not doing so many reviews anymore, but I used to do a lot of reviews, and sometimes, if you're like reviewing like 20, 30, 40 pull requests, it might sometimes pull requests might slip through the mailbox, and you did not notice that there was like that there was like another push. Mm-hmm. So. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that? I think it's not a bad thing to regularly ping someone.
I would tend to agree. What I said kind of comes from personal experience, where when I have been pushy without any instruction, and that could be something as small as a ping, or even kind of opening an issue and creating a plan for something, people will sort of offline be like, you're really pushy, Vanessa. Like, I don't like that. And so. And this is how I can think of 3 different cases where this has happened. And I don't know if it's because I'm a woman. I hope it's not that. But I really don't like being called pushy, because it feels like it's just very straightforward, advocating for your code or giving your opinion, wanting to have a discussion. So I've tended, because of that, to adjust my behavior to try to be less pushy, because I don't want to be called pushy. But I totally agree. If you have a community and it's huge like that, like I think it's essential to say, hey, ping over here. I know that you're working on 1,000 things. Don't forget about me. It's totally a cultural thing, and it's hard to tell when you first join a community whether you should be like that, or whether if you are like that, they're gonna be like, oh, I don't like this person. This person is very pushy.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So if you want to get anything into the Airflow community, feel free to ping once in a while if stuff gets stuck. It's a waste of code and also good effort to not get it into the into the master branch. So how would you see like people are like they're contributors, but at a certain point in time, they contribute so much they start owning maybe parts of the application, and they're being asked to like become a committer or a reviewer, as you call it. Is it like how do you see this transition? Have you maybe you could share some experiences on it, because you did a lot of open source work, right?
Yeah. So I presented the archetypes very black and white, like these are the contributors and these are the reviewers, but you'll probably notice that sort of the long-term contributor was a kind of reviewer. And that's definitely something that has happened. I can talk about personal experience. So I implemented a certain backend for an executor for a specific workflow software. And now I'm sort of the go-to person to respond to issues and, any fixes that need to be done. And slowly over time, that means I'm still a contributor, but I'm also more of a reviewer. And that's that kind of organic development and interaction is, I think, the best way to sort of become embedded in a community. There's a top-down approach where it's like, if you want to be part of this community, read all the documentation, check all these boxes on the list. But then there's a more organic approach where you find a community and you like what they're working on, you share the same values, and you contribute something, and you have a good experience, and you come back, and then you actually become more on the reviewer side. And it's not because you like checked off the boxes, it's because it felt like, because it was important to you in your heart, it was what you wanted to do.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, it's really hard. I think it's. I think I also noticed it with COVID-19, people working from home, right? You really have to stay in touch with people to. Sometimes if everything in writing doesn't really reflect like the emotions and the feelings and the empathy that lies behind
that's
it.
why you have to be so careful about your word choice, because you can have best intentions when you say something, but someone else across the world might read about it and be like, oh, that really kind of hurts my feelings. And the other challenge that I've kind of run into is that there are actually cultural differences in how people communicate. So the Western way, I guess I would say, is that when you are getting feedback about something, it's sort of wrapped in niceties, like, oh, you did such a good job here, but maybe you might want to look at that. And non-Western cultures may be sort of more succinct and to the point, like, okay, let's fix this, let's fix that, let's fix that. But if you're not expecting that, you might be like, oh, this person's like really, really mean. So it's good to have that expectation and to realize that that's just the way that, this particular culture is working on things. And after I had that personal experience too, and after that, I realized how refreshing it was to skip over the niceties and just to focus on the code and what needed to be done.
Yeah. I think it's also if there are not enough committers on the project, right? Then you have like people are very sparse on time, so then they also might want to skip the
niceties.
The niceties, exactly. Yeah. So a question: any tips on how we can handle issues better? We have seen many people asking Stack Overflow type questions. Yeah, I think this is like there's a question from the audience. So we have of course the issue tracker, and we see a lot of people like asking like, okay, how do I install Airflow on Windows? Just an example. It's not like a question to Airflow itself, but maybe it would be nice maybe to some additional documentation on this. Mm-hmm. How do you see this? Like more like the developer questions and also like the user questions?
Yeah, so I guess there's two kinds of issues. There's the kind of question that's like a question where you can post a link to the documentation and be like, okay, we've gone through this in detail, you just missed it, it's okay, here's the link, please take a look, let me know if you have any questions. And then that's actually good, because even though the issue is there, someone else can then search and find the issue if they don't find the documentation. The other kind of question that's more of a developer question, well, they'll say like, this is broken, here's my error. And the important thing to do there is to really ask, and people always forget to do this, but you need to ask for exactly enough to reproduce it. So you need to ask the versions of software that they're using, the exact thing that they ran. Because in my mind, if I'm a maintainer on a project, as soon as I can reproduce exactly what their bug is, I don't need to ask them anything else. I can like make a fix, I can do a pull request, I can say, hey, contributor, or if the person that opened the issue, please take a look at this, this pull request I opened, I think I've addressed your issue, here's how to test it, let me know how it goes. So.
Yes, there's a follow-up, and I want to know how to best we can handle it while still not making the other person feel bad. So I think the question is like, okay, if you have like a very trivial kind of Stack Overflow question in the issue tracker, how would you address this without being harsh?
I think it's very, I mean, it's common in your head to be like, oh, why didn't this person just read the getting started documentation? And, it's common to feel that way. But I think no matter what, you should just always respond with kindness. Be like, oh, thank you for, I'm so glad that you're checking out Airflow. We have really good description how this works here, but you don't want to ever target them. So it's different to say like, here's something that can help you, as opposed to like, why didn't you see this? We have it right over here. Like, what's wrong with you? I mean, like people won't come to ask a question on an issue if they found that very obviously. And yeah, it's true that sometimes there's a lot of documentation and things are hard to find. So you help them and you nicely answer their question, and you always treat them with respect, and just be a good person.
Makes sense. Yeah. Awesome talk. Would you be willing to contribute more to Airflow? It's like it's a very deep question.
Oh gosh, that's a hard question. I've thought about that. I think that I would definitely think hard about contributing again, because it was a very stressful and negative experience. That said, I realize that the community is growing and changing, and I shouldn't be so narrow-minded to like just turn it away forever. So I definitely think I would. And I think if I did again, I would, I'd phone a friend. I would find someone who was interested in the same things that I am, but also part of the Airflow community. So I wouldn't just be alone sort of on my side of the pull request.
Yeah.